You think fear is the enemy. The Stoics would tell you something far more dangerous. Fear is not what controls you. Your judgment about fear controls you. And once you understand that, fear loses something it has held over you for years: your obedience. Epictetus understood this nearly 2,000 years ago. You cannot control what happens to you. You can control what you make of what happens. That distinction is where fear begins to lose its power. Marcus Aurelius faced war, plague, betrayal, loss, and eventually death itself. Yet his philosophy was never about becoming a man who feels nothing. It was about becoming a man whose reason remains sovereign, even when life becomes unbearable. Seneca faced exile from everything he had built. He did not call himself fearless. He called himself governed by reason instead of by impression. That is the distinction this entire video is built on. Not the absence of fear, the refusal to let fear command the ruling faculty of your mind. The Stoics called this faculty the hegemonikon, the part of you that judges, that chooses, that decides what is worth pursuing and what is worth releasing. Zeno founded this school in Athens, teaching that virtue alone is sufficient for a good life. Not wealth, not reputation, not the approval of a crowd. Virtue, expressed through wisdom, courage, justice, and temperance. Chrysippus helped develop the Stoic view that fear involves judgment, not merely the event itself. The event happens to you. The judgment about the event is entirely your own creation. This is why two people can face the identical loss, and one is destroyed while the other remains steady. The difference was never the event. The difference was always the judgment they assented to. Today we uncover 10 Stoic principles that can change the way you meet fear forever. Each one builds on the last, moving from what you can control to what you can never lose. By the 10th, you will understand the one thing fear can never take from you, no matter what circumstance takes. What is the one thing you fear losing most? Sit with that question as we begin. Welcome to Stoic Virtus. Let's begin. The Stoics divided the entire world into two categories: what is up to us and what is not. Epictetus called this the dichotomy of control. Your judgment is up to you. Your effort is up to you. Your choice to act with virtue is up to you. The outcome, the opinions of others, the events that unfold around you, none of that belongs to you. Fear grows the moment you claim ownership over what was never yours to command. Picture a man walking into a room where his career will be decided. His reason tells him one thing is required of him: prepare with diligence, speak with honesty, act with virtue. His fear tells him something else entirely. You must control how this ends. The Stoic does not obey the second voice. He gives his full effort to what is his, and releases what is not. This is not indifference to outcomes. It is precision about ownership. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself daily that external events cannot touch the ruling faculty unless he grants them permission to. Marcus Aurelius repeatedly reminded himself to distinguish what happens from the judgment he adds to what happens. The event asks nothing of your peace unless you hand your peace over to it voluntarily. This is the discipline Epictetus placed at the very foundation of his teaching. Before wisdom, before courage, before justice. Because without first separating what is yours from what is not, none of the other virtues can be practiced correctly. A man cannot act with courage if he believes the outcome is his to guarantee. He cannot act with justice if he is negotiating with fear for a safer position. Think about the last time you refreshed a screen waiting for a reply that had not come yet. Refreshing the screen. Rehearsing what the silence might mean. None of that changes whether the reply arrives. It only spends the one resource that was always his to spend, his own attention, his own peace. The dichotomy of control is not one lesson among many. It is the doorway every other Stoic principle walks through. Try this the next time worry arrives. Ask a single question before doing anything else. Is this within my power to change? If yes, act. If no, release it and return your attention to what remains yours. The Stoic fights only on the ground that belongs to him. And there, he cannot be defeated by what lies outside his control. But knowing what is yours is only the beginning. The next question is harder. How do you know your own judgment is even telling you the truth? An impression arrives in the mind before you have chosen anything. A sensation, a thought, a sudden conviction that something is dangerous. The untrained mind treats every impression as fact. The Stoic treats it as a claim that must be examined. Epictetus taught a discipline of 3 movements. Impression, judgment, assent. Something happens. Your mind forms an impression of it. Then you judge that impression and decide whether to give it your assent. Fear only becomes suffering at the moment of assent, not at the moment of impression. Now consider the impression itself arriving. A stranger's silence, a rejection that has not been spoken, a failure that has not occurred. The untrained mind assents immediately and suffers as though it were already true. The Stoic pauses before assent. He asks a simple question of the ruling faculty. Is this impression a fact, or merely an appearance my mind has accepted without examination? Marcus Aurelius separated the event itself from the judgment his mind added to the event. The event is neutral. The judgment is where the suffering lives. He practiced describing events in the plainest terms possible, stripped of the dramatic language fear prefers to use. Not a disaster has struck me, simply a thing has happened. Not I have been humiliated forever. Simply a person disagreed with me in a room. Here is where this becomes real. A colleague's raised eyebrow in a crowded meeting. A pause before a reply. The untrained mind builds an entire story from that single second. Rejection, judgment, failure, all assented to before a single fact has been confirmed. The trained mind notices the impression and simply waits. This stripping away of exaggeration was a daily discipline, not a single moment of insight. The Stoics practiced it the way a soldier practices his stance, repeatedly, deliberately, until withholding assent from a false impression becomes as natural as breathing. Withhold your assent from what has not been proven, and the impression loses its command over you. But even once you master your judgments, there remains something you cannot argue your way out of. Loss. You fear losing people, wealth, status, the life you have built. The Stoics would not deny this fear. They would examine its foundation. Everything external to your own reason was never fully yours to begin with. It was lent to you by fortune, and fortune reserves the right to reclaim what it lends. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself daily that people change, circumstances shift, and even the body eventually returns to nature. This was not despair. It was the practice the Stoics called premeditatio malorum, the premeditation of adversity, not to invite suffering into the present moment, but to meet the future already prepared, so that when loss arrives it does not arrive as a stranger. Think of someone you love deeply. The Stoic does not love them less because he accepts impermanence. He loves them fully, while holding them with an open hand instead of a closed fist. What is the one thing you fear losing most? Comment it below. Naming it honestly is often the first step toward no longer being ruled by the fear of it. Seneca called externals indifferent, not because they do not matter, but because they are not the substance of a virtuous life. He wrote to a grieving friend that nothing should be embraced so tightly that its loss becomes unbearable, not because love should be shallow, because love rooted only in reason can survive the departure of what it loves. Epictetus went further still. Epictetus used the example of saying goodbye to a loved one, reminding his students that what they love is mortal and never fully within their possession, not to summon grief in advance, to love without illusion, so that when nature eventually reclaims what it lent you, you are not destroyed by a truth you refuse to face. Imagine sitting across from someone you love on an ordinary evening. Nothing dramatic, nothing urgent. The Stoic does not need tragedy to feel the weight of the moment. He already knows the moment is finite, and that knowledge makes the ordinary evening more precious rather than less. This is the deepest form of premeditatio malorum, not rehearsing catastrophe for its own sake, rehearsing reality so that reality never arrives as a stranger. Once you stop demanding permanence from what was never promised to last, loss stops being an injustice and becomes simply the nature of things. But accepting loss is not enough on its own. You must also stop retreating from what frightens you. Every time you retreat from what frightens you, you teach the ruling faculty that retreat is the correct response. Avoid the difficult conversation, and the impression of danger grows stronger the next time it appears. Epictetus did not teach his students to wait for a life free of difficulty. He taught them to meet difficulty with reason and with courage, one of the 4 cardinal virtues the Stoics placed at the center of a well-lived life. Courage is not the absence of fear. It is the judgment that virtue is worth pursuing even when fear is present. Cato stood against overwhelming political power, knowing the personal cost could be severe. He is remembered not for feeling no fear, but for judging that his integrity mattered more than his safety. The Stoic does not run toward hardship to prove he feels nothing. He simply refuses to let discomfort make his decisions for him. Marcus Aurelius could not escape war or political conflict. His philosophy was never built around waiting for comfort to arrive. It was built around returning again and again to duty, reason, and right action regardless of circumstance. He wrote that the obstacle in the path becomes the way forward, that what stands against the action can itself be turned into the action. A fire consumes whatever is thrown into it and grows brighter for the fuel. The trained mind treats difficulty the same way. Each hardship becomes material for virtue rather than a reason for retreat. This does not mean seeking out suffering for its own sake. The Stoics were not ascetics chasing pain as a trophy. They simply refused to arrange their entire lives around avoiding discomfort, because a life organized around avoidance is a life governed by fear rather than by reason. Think about the conversation you have postponed for months. Each day it stays unspoken. The impression of its danger grows a little larger in the mind. The conversation itself has not changed. Only your judgment about it has grown heavier through avoidance. That is the standard. Not how do I make this feel easy, but what does virtue require of me right now? Each act of courage, despite fear, strengthens the ruling faculty's command over impression. But courage alone will not move you if you are still waiting to feel ready. Many wait for confidence before they act. I will begin once I feel prepared. I will speak once I am certain. That certainty never arrives, because fear continually redefines what readiness means. Epictetus taught that circumstances do not determine character. Judgment and choice determine character. You do not need to feel fearless to act rightly. You decide what virtue requires, and you act while your emotions are permitted to accompany the decision without being permitted to author it. Marcus Aurelius trained himself to attend only to the action directly before him, not the entire uncertain future, simply the next right action, governed by reason rather than by feeling. This is self-command. The discipline the Stoics called enkratia, ruling the impulses of the moment through reason rather than being ruled by them. Marcus Aurelius repeatedly used his private reflections to examine his judgments, his impulses, and the actions required of him, not to record his day for others, simply to examine whether his own judgment had governed his actions or whether impulse had quietly taken the wheel. That single habit, repeated across decades, is one explanation for how a man carrying the weight of an empire could still write with such steadiness. Chrysippus is remembered for the argument that assent is always within our power, even when the impression itself is not. You did not choose the sudden fear that arrived in your chest before the difficult conversation. You do choose whether that fear is granted the authority to write your next sentence. That single choice, repeated daily, is the entire practice of Stoic self-command. Picture someone standing at the edge of a decision they have circled for a year. The business they have not started, the application they have not submitted. They are waiting for a feeling that was never going to arrive on its own, because the feeling was always meant to follow the action rather than precede it. Confidence is not the cause of right action, it is frequently the result of it. But once you begin acting rightly, a new question arrives. What happens when the world takes something away regardless? Fear grows large when you attach your worth to what fortune can remove. If my position is lost, I am nothing. If my wealth disappears, I have failed as a person. The Stoics called wealth, reputation, and comfort preferred indifference. Worth having when available, never the foundation of a virtuous character. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself constantly that these things could be taken at any moment by forces entirely outside his control. He was not pursuing numbness toward loss. He was refusing to let his ruling faculty be governed by what fortune could seize. The Stoics drew a careful distinction here that is often missed. Indifferent does not mean worthless. Health is preferred over sickness. Wealth is preferred over poverty. Reputation earned through virtue is preferred over disgrace. But none of these preferred things are necessary for a good life. Only virtue is necessary. This is why a Stoic can pursue a promotion, build savings, care about his standing among others, and still remain steady if all of it disappears overnight. He wanted these things. He did not need them to remain who he was. Now consider a sudden drop in income, a missed payment, a harder month than expected. The untrained mind treats this as a verdict on the person's entire worth. The trained mind treats it as a change in circumstance, nothing more. A fact to be managed with reason rather than a judgment to be suffered. Ask yourself honestly, if every external thing you possess were removed tomorrow, would your reason remain? Would your capacity for virtue remain? If the answer is yes, you have located the one possession fortune cannot reach. Your income can rise and fall like the tide. Your character does not have to move with it. That is a different kind of security than anything held in the hand. But detaching from wealth is easier than detaching from something far more personal. The opinions others hold of you. You rehearse your words because someone might disagree. You conceal your ambitions because someone might mock them. Epictetus taught plainly that another person's judgment of you is not up to you. Whether you surrender your peace to that judgment is entirely up to you. Marcus Aurelius lived under constant public scrutiny as emperor and continually redirected his attention back to virtue rather than reputation. He wrote privately, where no audience could ever read it, reminding himself that the applause of the crowd changes nothing about the quality of an action. A just act remains just whether it is praised or ignored. An unjust act remains unjust whether it is celebrated or condemned. Take a moment and notice what happens when someone shares an ambition out loud for the first time and receives laughter instead of encouragement. The ambition has not changed. Only a single opinion has entered the room, and opinions, however loudly spoken, are not verdicts. Praise and blame are both external. Both are indifferent to the state of your character. If praise can inflate the ruling faculty with vanity, blame can just as easily corrupt it with insecurity. In both cases, something outside you has been granted authority it was never owed. This does not mean rejecting all correction. The Stoic examines criticism the way he examines any impression. If it contains truth, he assents to it and improves. If it contains only noise, he withholds assent and continues. Once neither applause nor rejection can command your judgment, you have achieved something the Stoics considered close to freedom itself. But freedom from others' opinions raises a harder question. Can you remain steady with no one watching at all? One of the deepest fears people carry is solitude. Not simply the absence of company, the loss of an identity quietly built around another person's presence. The Stoics practiced self-sufficiency, the capacity of the ruling faculty to remain whole without external support. This was never a rejection of other people. It was a refusal to make peace dependent on their presence. Marcus Aurelius wrote often of retreating into his own mind as into an estate no army could invade. He called it the most peaceful retreat available to any man, requiring no journey and no permission from anyone else. Seneca also emphasized the value of withdrawing from distraction and examining whether your peace depends on external not out of contempt for others, but to test whether peace depended on anyone's presence at all. He found that a mind untrained in solitude will accept almost any company, however corrosive, simply to avoid sitting alone with itself. Picture someone staying in a room full of noise they do not enjoy, simply because the silence afterward feels worse than the noise itself. The Stoic asks a different question entirely. Not who will keep me company, but have I built a mind worth keeping company with? When the ruling faculty becomes strong through reason, solitude stops resembling abandonment. It becomes simply space in which to think clearly. A person who has trained this capacity can love others fully, without requiring them to complete what reason alone should provide. He can walk away from what corrupts his character, without believing his life has ended. But standing alone prepares you for something even larger, a future you cannot see and cannot predict. Most do not fear the future itself. They fear entering a future that offers no guarantee. The Stoics called this the acceptance of fate, not passive resignation, active cooperation with what reason cannot change. Marcus Aurelius governed an empire with no assurance of what tomorrow held. He did not make certainty a condition of his peace. He attended to what the present moment required and left the rest to nature and to fate. The Stoics believed the cosmos was governed by reason itself, what they called the logos, a rational order running through all things, whether or not any single event within it can be predicted by a human mind. To live according to nature meant cooperating with this order rather than resisting it. Not because resistance is forbidden, because resistance to what cannot be changed produces only exhaustion, while cooperation with it produces peace. Imagine waiting for a result you have no power to influence any further. A decision made by someone else, a diagnosis, an answer that has not yet arrived. The untrained mind spends that waiting period suffering the outcome in advance over and over, as though rehearsal could somehow change the verdict. The trained mind attends to what the present hour actually requires, and meets tomorrow only once tomorrow arrives. This is the difference between a mind ruled by impression and a mind governed by reason. One requires a guarantee before it can be calm. The other trusts its own virtue to meet whatever arrives. You may not know whether the effort will succeed. You can still act with virtue regardless of the outcome. That is what the Stoics meant by living according to nature, not demanding that nature conform to your wishes. Aligning your judgment with what actually is. The Stoic does not demand that reality follow his wishes. He prepares himself to meet reality as it arrives. The Stoic treats hardship this way, not as an insult from the universe, as something to be met with the right preparation, rather than resisted with useless protest. Everything you have practiced until now has been preparing you for one final truth. Fear has been asking the same question through every principle in this video. What if something happens that you cannot endure? The Stoic answer is not that nothing painful will occur. It is far stronger than that. Whatever occurs, I will meet it with reason and virtue and an undivided character. Marcus Aurelius understood that the world could take his comfort, his position, even the people he loved. There was exactly one possession it could never reach: the ruling faculty, the seat of judgment and reason itself. Marcus Aurelius repeatedly returned to the idea that the quality of a person's life depends greatly on the judgments of the mind, not on the circumstances surrounding it. Here is where this becomes real. Standing at the exact center of a genuinely difficult season, nothing resolved, nothing certain, and still, underneath all of it, one faculty remaining entirely intact: the capacity to judge rightly, to choose virtue, to decide who you will be in this hour regardless of what the hour contains. That is the final teaching of this philosophy. Your peace no longer depends on the world protecting you from harm. It depends entirely on whether you abandon your own reason when harm arrives. You can act without knowing the outcome. You can love without demanding permanence. You can lose what is external without losing what governs you from within. That is not the elimination of fear. Fear may still arise. The Stoics never claimed otherwise. Even Epictetus, even Marcus Aurelius, surely felt the sudden impression of danger more than once in their lives. The difference was never that the impression stopped arriving. The difference was that it stopped receiving their assent. Fear remains, and it no longer commands. That distinction is the entire philosophy in a single sentence. Here is what remains once the 10 principles are practiced together. You cannot control who stays. You cannot control what tomorrow brings. You can govern the reason that meets both. Marcus Aurelius did not become steady because life was gentle with him. He became steady because he refused to let circumstance govern what only he could govern. Epictetus taught inner freedom while living through circumstances that were far from free. He had been a slave before he became one of the most respected teachers in Rome. His body was never fully his own for much of his life. His judgment always was. And that was enough to build an entire philosophy upon. Seneca faced exile and still taught the world how reason meets adversity without surrendering to it. None of them escaped fear entirely. They simply stopped allowing it to command the ruling faculty. Seneca famously observed that we suffer more in imagination than in reality. Not to dismiss real hardship, but to name the specific place where most unnecessary suffering is manufactured. The mind, rehearsing disaster before disaster has any right to arrive. Stoicism does not promise you will avoid every hardship this philosophy describes. It promises something more durable than avoidance. That whatever arrives, you will meet it as the author of your own judgment, rather than as a servant of your own impressions. 10 principles. 1 faculty they all protect. The reason that governs how you meet whatever life brings you. This is Stoicism's final promise. Not a life without loss, not a life without difficulty. A character strong enough to meet both without abandoning itself in the process. Which Stoic principle are you taking with you today? Tell me in the comments below. This is Stoic Virtus. Have no fear. Not because life will become gentle. Not because loss will disappear. Not because pain will never come, but because whatever happens, you will still have the power to choose who you become in the middle of it. That is the freedom the Stoics were trying to teach you. And that freedom was yours all along. I will see you in the next one.